Now a word of caution. Please recognize you may come to believe, like many of your students do, that you are a scriptural, doctrinal, history expert. A recent study revealed that more people think they know about a topic, the more likely they are to allege understanding beyond what they know, even to the point of feigning knowledge of false facts and fabricated information.
Welcome to another episode of Mormon Discussion podcast. I'm your host, Bill Reel, and I'm joined again with Chris Bloxam. Chris, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me back on.
Awesome. It was a lot of fun having you at Sunstone at the session I just did on Joseph's treasure digging and seer stones, folk magic. You brought with you your never before seen Mark Hoffman seer stone. And the people seemed to really dig that. They were coming up afterward and taking lots of pictures. That was pretty cool.
It was a lot of fun. It was a good suggestion you had made to bring it.
Yeah, and it kind of tied it in really good with the session. it's a lot of fun being at Sunstone, but it's even more of a blast, when your good friend is the guy moderating your session.
Well, you're very kind.
So tonight, a lot of stuff's been going on as we've talked about, and it kind of led into us kind of quickly putting this episode together. But just a couple of days ago, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland of the Quorum of the 12 retracts this story that he tells over a month ago about these two brothers. One's a missionary and he's on a mission out in California, and he runs into his brother not really knowing it at first. There's some dogs, and these dogs are barking and chomping at the bit and charging the fence. And all of a sudden they get really quiet. And then suddenly these two missionaries, one of them being this guy's brother, but again, not knowing it, as the dogs quiet down, they essentially walk right through the gate. And in their conversation, they figure out that their brothers and this long lost brother who joins the Hells Angels and has these Doberman pinschers, ends up, being reactivated into the church. And it was a really cool miracle story. It got quite a bit of rounds in the Deseret News, and I know that there was somebody in my ward that mentioned it Sunday, and a lot of people were telling me that in their wards, people were telling the story. And then 3 days ago, Elder Holland retracts the story and says the thing was essentially all the miraculous pieces and parts of it were no longer true, and gone is the story, right?
Well, if all the miraculous parts of the story are gone, you're not left with any story, right?
No, you've got some guy who comes back to the church, which, that happens every day, and twice as many leave every day. So
yeah,
not a whole lot of miracle left. And it got the two of us thinking. We were wondering, what if we made a list of all the faith promoting stories we've heard that have been maybe even pieces of our testimony through the years, and we just went through them one by one and see if either one of us kind of know more about the story, and if there's maybe a little more yarn to these stories than what really occurred.
Ensure you do not teach things that are untrue, out of date, or odd and quirky.
Yeah, I kind of looked through some of these old stories that get retold, and, as you and I were talking about the Holland talk, one of the things that you and I discussed was, this only happened a couple of years ago. And it's only been retold as an authoritarian, from an authoritative perspective by Holland and Clark. And even still, there's a few more people, 5 or 6 others that went home and wrote it in their journals. And it's amazing that even now in 2017, over the last couple of years, this story has been, the facts have not been consistent. People are, the people that are retelling it are not retelling it the same way every time. And it's just such a current modern example of how a faith promoting story can start to change almost immediately after the event happens.
When you say that, what I think about, right, is there's stories of Jesus feeding 7,000 in one set of, one gospel, and then there's Jesus feeding 5,000 in another gospel. And throughout history, we've always tried to reconcile that by saying there's 2 separate occasions, and Jesus is just feeding a lot of people on both times. And the reality is, once you understand how this Elder Holland story just became almost got a life of its own, you begin to realize almost throughout religious history how it could be so easy for miracle stories to begin to shift and change, and the same story found a year later now contradicting itself.
Yeah, exactly. To me, the first story that, came to mind as you and I were talking was the transformation of Brigham Young. And you and I were kind of talking about this earlier, just kind of discussing how the story came to be. And I mean, without getting into all the details, everyone knows the basic outline of the story. Joseph Smith dies in June of 1844. Sidney Rigdon returns from Pittsburgh. The 12 come back from their missions. They're currently out trying to get Joseph Smith elected. They're out telling everyone his platform and letting everyone know that he's running for president of the United States, when word gets to them that Joseph Smith and Hiram have been killed in Carthage. So August, they all get together and they call a meeting. Sidney Rigdon gets there before the 12, and I think there's 9 members of the 12 on August 8th when they have the big meeting.
That sounds about right.
Is that right? I think there's 9 there. 5,000 saints in attendance. And if you'll remember, between 1834 and 1844, Joseph Smith suggests at least 8 different methods for succession. So it's really a complex, confusing time for the members of the church. So it's really anything goes. I guess it could go either way or any way, since they died so quickly and unexpectedly.
Right. And this story, I mean, I remember this was one of the stories I learned early on in my membership in the church, that the way in which we knew that the appropriate person or group to lead the church was Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 was the fact that when Brigham Young stood up to talk, this event happens where he speaks to the crowd, and all of a sudden he takes on the voice and appearance of the prophet Joseph Smith. And I built a piece of my testimony on that story, Chris, because that's what told me that the 12 were the successors to the church when Joseph passed away. And in fact, I think it's the Brigham Young manual that we did many, many years ago when they started these teachings of the presidents, that there's a whole chapter dedicated to the 12 having the keys, how we knew they were supposed to lead. And so we spend some emotional capital, time, resources, energy learning that story.
Yeah, but when you look into it, you realize that Brigham Young doesn't even think or realize, or he's not even purporting that this is exactly what Joseph Smith wanted to do. I believe it's 1847 in winter quarters that Brigham Young says that had Hiram Smith lived, he should be the leader of the church. So it's really indicative of what was going through his mind, and him not realizing or not, it not being clear to him, even in 1847, that the 12 were the ones that were supposed to take over if Joseph died.
Which is huge if we don't have the transfiguration, Chris, but we have it, right? We've got Brigham Young literally transfiguring right before the entire multitude. And everyone, like I'm guessing everybody runs home and writes that in their journals, correct?
Well, no. In fact, I don't think there's any contemporary writings of anyone. In fact, I've got Wilford Woodruff's journals in front of me. If I pull out volume 2, Wilford Woodruff was a prolific diary keeper. And if I turn to the page of August 8th, 1844, Wilford Woodruff wrote 7 pages in his diary that day. 7 pages. And there's not one mention of the mantle transferring to Brigham Young or any sort of transfiguration or his speech changing or anything of note. There's a lot of, he records a lot of what Brigham Young said, but nothing having to do with the transfiguration.
But okay, so Wilford Woodruff doesn't say anything, but Orson Hyde does, right? Like Orson Hyde is an important person in the church, and he writes later on in his journal that he saw this whole event take place, correct?
Yeah, he's one of the first people to retell the story of the day that, of this meeting on August 8th. He's one of the first to retell the story of this meeting. But the problem is that Orson Hyde wasn't even there. He doesn't get to Nauvoo for another 5 days.
So Orson Hyde writes in his journal, he tells others that he's seen this event, and he's kind of, like you say, he's one of the first ones who spreads the word that this event has taken place. And you're saying that he doesn't arrive in Nauvoo till after 5 days later from the event that he's testifying he saw happen.
Yeah, and there were other church leaders that are of note that recorded the events of that day. For example, Parley P. Pratt in his autobiography, I think it comes out in 1856, 1857. He's killed in May of 1857, and he's just almost done completing his autobiography. He writes about that event and doesn't mention the Transfiguration. Thomas Bullock, Jacob Hamlin, there's a lot of other church leaders that are there. But Orson Hyde's kind of good for this. If we need somebody to retell a church event to support a current narrative, Orson Hyde, this isn't the only time that he steps forward and adds some authority.
Yeah, he certainly puts some flavor, I think, sometimes in events to make them a little more supernatural. But there is, if I'm not mistaken, Chris, there is one contemporary source that locks down this Brigham Young transfiguration. It's, I believe it's in a diary of George, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, Laub, L-A-U-B? Does that sound familiar?
Okay, Bill, you're right. George Laub is the only supposed contemporary account. There is a supposed contemporary account, but it's the only one. And what do you think of that account, Bill?
Well, the interesting thing is that it is a diary reference. It is supposed to have been written in 1846, so shortly after, but it's much more contemporary than the other accounts that we have. And so they've done this thing, a small tan-colored leather diary that he's got that's misled so many scholars. They've done a study on this diary, and they realized that it's a copy of the original by Laub, and that it has additions to it. And so we actually discover the original diary, and the original diary, which we now have, in existence, we can go to it, we can look at it, contains no reference to the Transfiguration of Brigham Young. And I think this is an awkward thing for early Latter-day Saints, but there's this understanding that early in church history, the leaders of the church and their scribes and some of the other members that they give the responsibility to were often asked to take some of these early documents and to almost impose a different historical statement into some of these pieces and parts. And one of them that this seems to have happened with is the George Laub diary, which later on has the addendum put into it as if it's the original, that he's seen the Brigham Young Transfiguration, when in reality it is not in his original writings, which I think is crazy once you open the door to any early church document being fiddled with and you having to take that into account as you examine each and every document on its own merit.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a great point. What about another story? What about another story from church history?
You name one. Let's pick one. Pick one that was like something you thought about through your time in the church that you saw as being miraculous. And let's see if I've got anything to add to it.
Well, what about Quetzalcoatl? That was something that was big when I was on my mission in the 80s.
Yeah, there's still guys down there doing tours, right? There's still guys showing you old baptismal fonts that are holes in the ground.
Yeah, we used to show as missionaries the video. What was it? Ancient America Speaks.
With the old guy, and he would tell you where King Benjamin maybe stood in the Americas and where he gave his sermons at. Yeah. So Quetzalcoatl, it's an interesting idea. I think a lot of Latter-day Saints early on, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, really would have built this as kind of a part of their testimony, because there were so many stories going around, including the video you speak of, one of the things we've come to grips with is that scholars like Brent Gardner, who's a very faithful, very an apologist in some ways for the church, very well respected within Orthodox circles, has done a lot of research on Quetzalcoatl, and essentially has arrived at the idea that the stories originally told about this white god from the Indians' own language in their own narrative are very different from what the Spaniards picked up on and retold. And so while what the recounting was by the Spaniards, which in a sense was kind of a distorted story similar to the one we started talking about today with Elder Holland, the Spaniards told a certain story about this white god. And once we go back into the original native language, those connections disappear. And so to say that there's this great white god, he's going to return, it was the Quetzalcoatl of the Native Americans, that is pretty much all died out. You don't see really anybody having those conversations today because that scholarship is no longer seen as up to date and valid in what it says. So that's another one we just have to set down, Chris. Like you can't plan on these Indians who are also Lamanites having had these big stories in their narratives about this great white bearded god returning. So that's another one we just have to just set aside and move on. But I'm sure we've got some good ones in here.
Yeah, like we just got back from Salt Lake. You remember seeing the monument of the Seagull that we drove by?
Yeah, the giant bird, right? The story that I remember hearing, Chris, is that when the Saints get out west to Utah, it's really tough terrain. They're trying to get their crops in the ground, trying to get this started, and they really need this to go well. And these seagulls come along, they eat these crickets, throw them back up, and then go and eat some more. And this is just one of the greatest miracles it's trumped up as Mormonism. So great, right? That a seagull is the state bird. Yeah.
And seagulls do eat crickets, and they do eat bugs. But, yeah, the story goes that in 1848, so the Saints arrive in 1847, July, and the very first crop is being harvested from the fall in the spring of 1848. However, there was a late frost, and there was a drought, and there were also crickets. And Bill Hartley does a fantastic article on this, that he went back and kind of got to the bottom of it. One of the very first complete accounts of the cricket story is told in 1930 by Susie Young Gates. She was the daughter of Brigham Young. She wrote a biography called The Life Story of Brigham Young. And it's the most complete story we have. It's not the earliest one, but it's the most complete. But you know who the first person to tell the Seagull story is? Any idea, Bill? Take a guess.
Let me throw a guess out
there. Take a guess.
Orson Hyde.
Orson Hyde. That's right. Who also wasn't there, by the way.
Not there again.
No, he was actually on a mission in Europe at the time.
It's interesting that he's unpresent for a lot of miracles.
Yeah, and he says, I have a quote here by him. So this is in 1853. He says, the hand of providence prepared agents and sent them to destroy the destroyer, a circumstance that was rare, one that was never known to exist before and never since to any extent. But that's not true. These crickets are actually, they're a type of cicada, and they come out every 7 years and swarm. So basically there's a hatch of these locusts every year. And sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's not as bad. But what also happens is there's no contemporary newspaper or journal accounts of this miracle of the seagulls eating the crickets and saving the Latter-day Saints crops. One story that's told later is that the seagulls come and eat the crickets, but then throw up the crickets so they can eat more. But we've learned since that seagulls don't digest the whole cricket, and they throw up every time. They can't digest the wings and the legs, I believe. So that wasn't,
So you're saying that seagulls have always eaten crickets, that there's a bigger hatch of these crickets every so many years, and that seagulls like to feed on these crickets and naturally eat them, throw them up, parts of them, and then go back and eat some more.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Bill, what about the Thomas Marsh story? That's told as a faithful, it's kind of like the Holland story, isn't it? Isn't it told from a faithful perspective to teach a lesson?
It is, and it makes its way into our manual every 4 years. Of course, we've just had a lesson on this in Sunday school. So for those who were serving down in primary or in some other auxiliary that kept you out of Sunday school, you missed out on this opportunity to talk about Thomas Marsh. But the basic premise is that Thomas Marsh leaves the church because his wife and Lucinda Harris are having this squabble over this arrangement they've made to, somebody milks the cow and gets the milk, and then they parse out the cream and the strippings, and this person gets the cream and that person gets the strippings, and they trade things back and forth. And so they each benefit from this relationship. And apparently one of them begins to not live up to their end of the deal, and so the squabble begins. And the story goes that Thomas Marsh and his wife, Elizabeth, I believe it is, they appeal to the first presidency after being told by the local leadership that they, as the Marshes, were in the wrong. And keep in mind that Marsh is the president of the 12 at this time. They appeal to the first presidency and they are denied again. And again, allegedly, Thomas Marsh leaves the church over this incident because of the arrangement his wife had with Lucinda Harris. Several things factor into this. And again, I think the idea we're trying to teach here is that people leave the church over nonsense. People leave the church over petty reasons, simple reasons. And anytime someone leaves the church, you can just assume they haven't prayed enough, they weren't faithful enough, they wanted to sin, they were lazy, or they just didn't like the arrangement and were in the wrong with some milk and strippings. The trouble is twofold. One is that Marsh gives us the reasons he leaves the church. And the main reason he names is that he's very disappointed in the Latter-day Saints in the way that they're treating their neighbors. They're forming mobs. They are carrying out violence on their non-Mormon neighbors. He also has some discomfort with polygamy as well. And that comes out a little bit, especially when he returns to the church and Brigham Young is having a conversation as they decide whether to bring him back in or not. The other side of this story that needs to be mentioned is that again, we don't know the exact dates, but approximately 6 months before this squabble ends up in an appeal to the first presidency, Joseph Smith, the prophet, has just taken Lucinda Harris as a plural wife, or at least has entered some type of relationship, and even LDS Orthodox scholars
connubial relationship.
Called it a connubial. Yes, a connubial relationship, which means it involved all the facets of a real marriage, which essentially is their nice way of saying that Joseph and Lucinda likely had sex. And so Joseph marries Lucinda Harris, and then shortly after, Thomas Marsh and Elizabeth Marsh appeal to the first presidency against Lucinda Harris, not knowing about this relationship. Chris, what do you think the chances are that Joseph would side against his plural wife that he's keeping secret from everybody else in the church?
I think that's 0. Is there a number less than 0? -1?
Nope, that's as low as you get. So there's no chance that Joseph Smith and the first presidency are going to side with the Marshes. So if the milk and stripping story did happen, and the only evidence we have is that Thomas Marsh says that whatever issue was going on between him and George Harris, it had been resolved. We don't have Thomas Marsh ever talking about this account, and it comes rather late, I believe from maybe George Smith in like 20 years later. And so it's not a story you want to spread around as if it was a true valid story. And even if it did happen, it didn't happen the way we like to talk about it, say it, portray it. And so we're better off just not running Marsh's name through the mud. I'll tell you another story, Chris, that I was quite entertained with early on in my time in the church, is the idea of, is it Lorenzo Snow who goes into the temple, and this is, I think, in the midst of this transition of the prophet before him passing away, but he tells us, right? He tells us that he saw Jesus Christ in the temple. What do we know about this story?
Yeah, Wilford Woodruff has just died in San Francisco, and his body's coming back on a train. And Lorenzo Snow is in the Salt Lake Temple, and the way the story is told, I mean, it's fascinating because Lorenzo Snow doesn't write this story in his journal. He doesn't tell anybody about it, except he tells his granddaughter, and I think her name was Allie Young Pond, and she's a young girl, and he tells the story to her much later, and then, I don't know, 3 or 4 years later, and then she relays the story 30 years later to Lorenzo Snow's son. So this is a third-hand story that's 30 years after the fact. And if you recall, he's in the temple with his granddaughter, or it could be his niece, and he says, I want to stop right here, and I want to tell you something. It was right here that the Lord Jesus Christ appeared to me at the time of the death of President Woodruff. And I'll read it exactly as he says it. He instructed me to go right ahead and reorganize the first presidency of the church, and not wait as it had been done after the death of the previous presidents, and that I was to succeed President Woodruff. He stood right here, 3 feet above the floor, and it looked as though he stood on a plate of solid gold. So, fascinating. I'm with you on this story because it's fascinating. If Jesus Christ, the fact that Jesus Christ would appear to a latter-day prophet, and the reason that he appeared was to simply say, don't hesitate to reorganize the first presidency. It seems a little anticlimactic. Does it to you?
Sure, but if he is doing it on this small occasion, then certainly he's meeting with them regularly to talk about big issues as well.
Yeah, but something that's interesting about the story is that years later, Heber J. Grant says that no prophet has seen Christ since Joseph Smith. That's a little bit of a twist in the story, don't you think?
Yeah, but we've got Lorenzo Snow, right, in his own words telling this story?
Well, he doesn't tell it to anyone that we can verify. He tells it to his granddaughter, who tells it to Lorenzo's son 40 years after the fact.
So do we have this sister Pond? Do we have her recounting of it in her own journal, or did she give a talk in sacrament meeting once, or
no? No. The person that tells the story is Leroy C. Snow, which is 30, 40 years after the fact, and he says it was Lorenzo Snow's granddaughter, or possibly niece, that told him the story. So it's a third-hand account that's 30 to 40 years after the fact.
But I'm sure she was alive at this point that we could go back and ask her, right? Like somebody went to her and asked her.
No, she's passed away.
So she was passed away when Leroy decided to tell this story. It's at this point a third-hand story, and neither of the first or second-hand witnesses are alive.
Right. It's probably more of it falls in the category of folklore.
Chris, we're beginning to slice and dice these. I'm hoping we have some really good ones here left that are going to stand up. Let's try another one.
Well, okay. There is what about the story that we've all heard that Moroni blessed the Manti temple site?
So you're right. And this is an interesting one because there's actually a map in existence that the early leaders of the church, Brigham Young, maybe Wilford, Woodruff, John Taylor, sometime around their presidencies, there's this map floating around that shows Moroni's travel from the eastern side of the United States out to Salt Lake City. Sometime while he's out there, he goes to Manti, the temple site, blesses the temple site, carrying the gold plates the whole time with him, sword of Laban, in the Liahona, right? Because we have some records that show the Liahona might have been with this stuff. And then we also have the Nephite spectacles, the Urim and Thummim. And so Moroni's carrying all this stuff, and he goes out to Utah, blesses the Manti site, stops off in Arizona for something, and then makes his way back to Palmyra to bury the plates in the drumlin in New York that we suppose is the Hill Cumorah. There's a lot of debate there. The trouble here is this. Forever we've tried to have this debate of, is it humanly possible for a single person to go from, for instance, Central America, which is one proposed idea of where the Book of Mormon took place, and then make their way all the way to Palmyra, New York, all by themselves, single-handedly. And Mark Wright, who's an apologist for the church, I believe he might even work for BYU, works in, this type of stuff in the anthropology, geography, different kinds of studies that deal with kind of showing historicity of Book of Mormon. And, Brother Wright says that there's one human being on record through the history of mankind who has made this kind of a travel by themselves. But there's a problem. Moroni doesn't just need to make it from Central America to Palmyra. He needs to make it from wherever the Book of Mormon takes place out to Utah, then to Arizona, and then back to Palmyra. In that distance, the change in weather, the animals that he would have encountered, the different landscapes he would have encountered, like no one's ever done that. And not only has no one ever done that, but no one's done half that. And no one's done like a third of that. And so once you realize just how treacherous a journey that would be for one person to go by themselves carrying a giant sack of all this stuff, we know the plates weighed 60 pounds. What does the sword of Laban weigh? Another 20, 30 pounds? Now you've got the breastplate, you got the Urim and Thummim. So now Moroni's got 100 pounds on his back, and he's traveling all the way out to the western side of the United States and then back again. No one's ever done it. If you want to say like, God's a God of miracles and he made the way, that's fine. It would just be, by all reason and rationale, it would be the most preposterous journey to turn into a real valid thing that happened that anyone's ever heard in the history of verifiable history.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And maybe Moroni buried everything. Maybe he just walked without this stuff. Maybe he left the plates and the sword of Laban and the, Nephite interpreters in the ground. I don't know, but it certainly doesn't, to go through all that trouble to etch these things. I can't imagine him burying them and then walking to the other side of the United States, feeling safe having left the plates back somewhere else.
So why would Brigham Young, if the story's manufactured, do you think that it's recorded wrong, or do you think Brigham Young could have said that?
So I think Brigham says it, and I think we have to get back into the same thing that happens with Elder Holland last week, which is that when we hear a story or think an idea, and when we go back in time too, the way we tell history is so much different. Today we tell history in a way that we need to get our facts straight. We need to get as close to the actual event as we can and tell it as close to the actual event as we can. And the reality is, the further back you go in time, the more acceptable and almost encouraged it is to embellish stories and to change the facts so that you can even tell a false story to teach a true principle, and people would consider that of worth and acceptable. And one example would be pretty, somewhat recent history is George Washington and the cherry tree. That makes its way into George Washington's story. We come to grips that it doesn't really happen, and yet for some time people still tell the story because it teaches an important principle. And so we just have to come to grips that on some level Brigham Young likely was embellishing or, feeling like this had to have happened, like there had to be a temple site and it had to be blessed. So let's assume Moroni did it. And we have to allow room that folklore and fables make their way into our history.
Yeah. It's, it's similar to the story, as you were talking, I was thinking about John Taylor's watch and how the story about, what I'm talking about, how the watch, he's shot in the watch and it saves his life. He's blown back into the room.
Yeah. I mean, it's the only reason he lived and others died in that room that day.
And he's the one that tells the story. He believes he's shot in the watch. He believes it's,
Ooh.
He tells the story of it, let me look it up real quick. He says, my family, we were not a little startled to find out that my watch had been struck with a ball. I sent for my vest, and upon examination, it was found that there was a cut, as if with a knife, in the vest pocket. The fragments of the glass were found literally ground to powder. It then occurred to me that a ball had struck me at the time. I felt myself falling out the window. Let's see. Ball struck my watch. It forced me back. The problem is you can get on Google and pull up an image of John Taylor's watch. And, there's no bullet hole in it.
But he knew he had the watch, and he says it hit the watch, and he says it struck. I mean, there has to be a bullet hole, right?
Well, you can look it up yourself and look at it. There's no bullet hole. The glass is shattered. But otherwise the watch is intact. The hands are missing, although at the time the watch had stopped at exactly 5:16 on the day of the martyrdom, June 27th, 1844. But there's no bullet hole in the watch.
So this story, again, told by the very person it happened to, and you're right, Chris, I'm just looking it up now. So LDS Living Magazine, if you were to search John Taylor watch Carthage, you get LDS Living Magazine has this search result that comes up that says it's a story about how the watch saved John Taylor's life. And then right underneath it is another link to LDS Living Magazine, which is 3 Mormon myths you likely don't know. And number 2 is that the watch that saved John Taylor's life actually didn't catch a bullet and save his life. It's just a myth. And so even LDS Living is telling a contradictory story through 2 of their articles. And like you say, if John Taylor tells this himself, we just have to come to grips with how easy it is, even for the very person that the events happened to, for a story to get out of hand and become larger than life.
Yeah, I've been to Carthage jail probably 24 times. And every time I sit in the martyrdom room, I think, as you're looking at the bullet hole in the door and the one that was shot through the lock. And I think of the moment that this went down. And, Joseph's attorney, who was the first one to go back to the room and kind of categorize what had happened, counted 35 bullet holes in the room, but he couldn't find any bullets. Scavengers had already been through and picked them off as souvenirs, most likely. But one thing he does note is there's a blood stain on the floor. And as we bought the jail and took care of it, our church, and took people on tours, we put a clear plastic box over the top of it to protect it for many, many, many years. And it wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s that we pulled up the floorboards and threw them away so that the stain isn't there. And even that's a fascinating story about faith, a faith promoting story that people that I've met have said they remember when the blood stain was there.
And wasn't there a story of somebody who ran the house that in order to kind of keep the story going and keep it as a discussion piece, they would take like ketchup, barbecue sauce, and grape jelly and like rub it on the floor to like make the stain more prominent?
I don't know if that was the recipe, but when you hear a story like that, and I would imagine that anyone listening to us talk about this would think, did the church really allow Hiram's blood to lay on the floor until the late 1970s, early 1980s? Wouldn't that be almost a sacred site? I just can't imagine they would just leave it there for people to walk across or, keep a carpet over or whatever. And it's not the case. The floorboards were taken up years and years ago, and the stain that was on the floor wasn't Hiram's blood. So you're right. But I don't know about the formula. You're talking about somebody throwing ketchup on there every day. I don't know about that. That seems a little silly, but.
I was reading, I don't know if it was Dialogue. I think it had to be a Dialogue article, maybe a Journal of Mormon History, but and I'll link this. We'll link tons of, websites and different URLs that you can go to and kind of look all these things up yourself. But I'm 100% sure there is a Dialogue or Journal of Mormon Thought or some other scholarly article out there that talks about the person who took care of the home, or taking care of the jail, property would go every once in a while and make the blood stain look a little darker by adding things to it.
That would be fascinating if you could come up with the formula.
Okay, yeah, I think it's like 2 parts barbecue sauce, 1 part.
What about the miracle of when Mary Fielding's ox is revived? Do you remember that story?
Yeah, doesn't Mary Fielding, she gets her consecrated oil out that she just consecrated, a couple hours earlier, and her oxen falls to the ground, and Mary Fielding Smith walks up and anoints the oxen with oil, lays her hands on its head, and it arises, right?
Yeah, its name was Old Bully, wasn't it? Wasn't that the name of it?
Old Bully.
Old Bully.
This is actually one of the miracles that I think somewhat stands, although not in the way that we tell it. So, yeah, in fact, I'll just read, I guess, a bit of the actual event, how it happened. But the story we tell people is that the ox becomes ill or falls or whatnot, and she lays her hands on its head and blesses it. So it is a myth in that sense, because that's not what happens. But this story is still, I think, somewhat inspiring. So for those who are gonna, criticize this episode and say we're just tearing all these things down, like, truth to me is important. I know it's important to you, Chris. We want to go through these miracle stories and talk about them. But if there is something still miraculous that happens, like, yeah, absolutely, let's hold it up and let's talk about it. And in this case, it says, things went along quite smoothly, until they reached a point midway between the Platte and the Sweetwater rivers. Remember that name, Chris, Sweetwater River? We'll get back to that one in a little bit. Mm-hmm. That's a much more interesting tale. When one of Mary's best oxen lay down in the yoke as if poisoned, and all supposed he would die. All the teams in the rear stopped, and many gathered around to see what had happened. In a short time, the captain perceived that something was wrong and came to the spot. The ox stiffened in the throes of death. The captain blustered about and exclaimed, "He is dead. There is no use working with him. We'll have to fix up some way to take the widow along. I told her she would be a burden on the company." But in this he was greatly mistaken. Mary said nothing, but went to her wagon and returned with a bottle of consecrated oil. She asked her brother, Joseph and James Lawson, to administer to her fallen ox, believing that the Lord would raise him. It was a solemn moment there under the open sky. A hush fell over the scene. The men removed their hats. All bowed their heads as Joseph Fielding, who had been promised by Heber C. Kimball that he would have power to raise the dead, knelt, laid his hands on the head of the prostrate ox, and prayed over it. The great beast lay stretched out and very still. Its glassy eyes looked nowhere. A moment after the administration, the animal stirred. Its huge hind legs commenced to gather under it. Its haunches started to rise. The forelegs strengthened. The ox stood, and without urging, started off as if nothing had happened. This amazing thing greatly astonished the onlookers. They hadn't gone very far when another ox, Old Bully, lay down under exactly the same circumstances. This time it was one of her best oxen, the loss of which would have been very serious. Again, the holy ordinance was administered, with the same results strengthened. The ox stood, and without urging, started off as if nothing had happened. This amazing thing greatly astonished the onlookers. Now, that's the account of the story.
What's the problem with that? That sounds amazing.
It is. It sounds crazy. It sounds miraculous. Man, I'm trying to find it in a world where 2 oxen within minutes of each other on the same team fall to the ground dying, and all the other people are still kind of moving along. I don't know. I don't know what to make of this. Do you have any other data on this story, Chris?
I don't. This to me is one that maybe falls in the area of folklore or myth, or maybe it's a miraculous event.
Right. Was it hot? Did they have leg cramps? I mean, I don't know what was going on. But whatever happened, these ox got back up after blessings, and they continued the journey. Yeah,
to me that's a cool story. What about, since we're talking about pioneers coming west, and you mentioned that it happened between the Platte and the Sweetwater, I immediately think about the rescue of the boys that carry the members of the William Martin wagon trains across the Sweetwater. Is that what you were thinking when you said, remember that name?
It is. And that's a big miracle, right? That I think, in fact, President Hinckley, I'll read the story and then why don't you tell us maybe some of the details that that you've discovered with this story. But President Hinckley recounts this story in General Conference. President Hinckley gives the talk in General Conference. It is October 1981. The title of his talk is 4 B's for Boys. 4 B's for Boys. And in this talk, he restates a quote that was stated much earlier in LDS history. It was originally in the Improvement Era. Back then, the Improvement Era in the early 1900s was a really big book. It wasn't the small magazine that it became later on. January 1914, pages 209 to 211. And then it was also again in the February 1914, page 287 and 288. And President Hinckley quotes this almost verbatim. Here's what he says. After every apparent avenue of escape seemed closed, 3 18-year-old boys belonging to the relief party came to the rescue, and to the astonishment of all who saw, carried nearly every member of that ill-fated handcart company across the snowbound stream. The strain was so terrible, and the exposure so great, that in later years all the boys died from the effects of it. When President Brigham Young heard of this heroic act, he wept like a child, and later declared publicly, that act alone will ensure C. Allen Huntington, George W. Grant, and David P. Kimball an everlasting salvation in the celestial kingdom of God, worlds without end, unquote. So 1981, President Hinckley retells the story, 3 18-year-old boys. He makes it sound like they died some years later, but that it was close enough to the event that Brigham Young wept because of their deaths and assured the people he spoke to that they would have eternal life and exaltation with their Father in heaven in worlds without end. So Chris, please don't tell me this story didn't happen this way.
Yeah, it didn't happen that way. Well, first of all, there's a doctrinal issue with Brigham Young saying this very act alone ensures these boys' place in the celestial kingdom. That's not doctrinally accurate. What about ordinances? What about, priesthood and temple marriage? And you can't do one good act and erase a lifetime of sins along with the things that are necessary for exaltation.
And they haven't had their calling and election made sure yet, right?
I doubt it because they were pretty young. The other problem with that story is that didn't he say they were all 18?
3 18-year-old boys. He even gives their names. C. Allen Huntington, George W. Grant, and David P. Kimball, the 3 18-year-old boys who went into the icy waters that day and didn't live for much longer after that.
Yeah, well, none of the 3 were 18.
Okay, so maybe they're 17, 19, and several months shy of their 18th birthday. Yeah. Maybe that's what they are, but they all died pretty soon, right?
No, they didn't die soon. I can look, let me tell you the dates here. Let's see. George W. Grant, was, quote, made an invalid for life. That's one of the early tellings of the story because of the crossing the Sweetwater. But Grant's reported health problems were not enough to keep him from serving a 4-year mission to England beginning in 1861. That was 5 years after the rescue, and he died at the age of 32 in the year 1872, nearly 16 years after the Sweetwater rescue. He was the first to die, and he died of tuberculosis.
What year did Brigham Young pass away?
1877.
Okay, so Brigham's pretty old by this point too and doesn't last many years beyond this gentleman's death.
Right. And then David Kimball, the other rescuer, he died in 1883 at the age of 44. He lived a very active life as well. And then C. Allen Huntington, the other boy, died a few weeks shy of his 65th birthday in 1896. Having several run-ins with the law during his lifetime. Let's see, he ended up working on a ferry in southern Utah. Let's see. Yeah,
but
he was in jail a lot.
Once Brigham Young has promised you your exaltation, it's kind of like having your calling and election made sure. It doesn't really matter if you have run-ins with the law after that, does it?
I don't know. He certainly had a lot of them. He was arrested many times after that. I don't know, maybe.
He was in more than one set of icy waters, huh?
That's right. Oh my goodness. What else?
So, I was going to say, another story that I know you're fond of is President Wilford Woodruff. Like, we've been dismantling some miraculous stories where something really cool happened, or maybe one person saw a single resurrected being. But in the case of Wilford Woodruff, we have him telling us that the founders of this country as a group visited him, notified him that his temple ordinances have not been done yet, and that they need to be attended to. And like, we can't put this story down because there's more than one resurrected, but there's more than one spiritual being appearing to Wilford Woodruff. This is going to be a tough one, I think, to dismiss, Chris.
Well, yeah, on the surface it would be, because he tells the story for the first time in September 1977, just a few months after he says that it occurred. And then he tells it again in 1892, and then just a few months before he dies in 1898. So he tells the story 3 times in his lifetime. The reason the story is problematic is because the founding fathers that appeared to him, and there were also women too, is that several of these people had already had their temple work done, or already had been baptized. Benjamin Franklin, he probably holds the record out of all these people for the most baptized founding father. He's baptized first in Nauvoo by John Harrington. I'm sorry, as proxy. He's not physically baptized. He's proxy. And then he's also...
Yeah, that would be weird.
Yeah, that's strange. That makes the story even better. And then his work is done again in 1871 in the Endowment House by Hayden Church. And then again in 1876. And you got to remember, 1876 would have been a big year. That's the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Ooh, yes.
So there's celebrations all across the country. There's speeches. I mean, everybody's thinking about the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And there were 56 signers, if you recall that number. And John Bernheisel and Hayden Church do the work for all the signers of the Declaration of Independence in 1876. And then just a year later, Wilford Woodruff does the work for them again. And then we're still on Benjamin Franklin. His work is done again in 1880 in the St. George Temple, then again in 1884 in the St. George Temple, then in 1972 in the London Temple, 1975 in the Mesa, Arizona Temple, and then later 1992 the Boise Temple.
Maybe this story has just been told wrong. Maybe these guys didn't come to say it's never been done. Maybe they came to say, like, knock it off. We've had it too many times. It seems, I mean, you got Woodruff saying, here's what Woodruff says was told to him. You have had the use of the endowment house for a number of years, and yet nothing has ever been done for us. By specifying the endowment house and saying nothing had been done, the implication, right, Chris, is that the baptisms and endowments and perhaps even sealings had not been done for these men. And yet, as you're pointing out, most of them had these things done at least once, and many of them had like these ordinances done multiple times over before Woodruff gets this visitation.
Yeah, like George Washington, for example, was proxy baptized at least 3 times that we know of before the saints even left Nauvoo. And I'll tell you another interesting part of this story. When Hayden Church and John Bernheisel do the work in 1876, guess who does the confirmations? J.D. McAllister, who in 1 year later is the person that does the baptizing for Wilford Woodruff. After Wilford Woodruff says, I've just had this vision of the founding fathers saying they haven't had their work done.
And he doesn't inform him that Wilford is duplicating the work.
Now,
do you think,
I know you and I like to laugh about these things, because
right?
Can't you see J.D. McAllister doing the baptism thinking, I can't tell him. I can't tell him we did this last year. Let's just let the moment be, right? Let's just let it go.
Right. And it's not like he's saying a couple of them. I mean, he tells us all these names of people, makes it sound like it's a pretty large group, and it's the very people he's naming that have already had their ordinances done.
Yeah. To me, that's a problematic story. Lots of issues with that story. What about, what about you've heard the story of the Salt Lake Temple having elevator shafts in it, right?
Sure, this is another great miracle. Brigham Young, before there's any such thing as elevators, makes plans for the Salt Lake Temple, receives revelation from God on the floor plan, very similar to the way that Joseph Smith received floor plans for the Kirtland and Nauvoo Temple. So Brigham Young receives the revelation for the Salt Lake Temple, and in the wisdom of God, plans ahead to have these spaces, these columns of spaces in the building structure, so that later on when elevators are invented, they essentially fit right into those spaces, and it's like it was made for those. Right? That did happen, right, Chris?
Yeah, well, not exactly that way. Yeah, not exactly. The elevator was invented by Otis in America in 1854. He got his patent. I think he got his patent in 52 actually, but he shows it off in the World's Fair in 54. Bill, I believe the architect was Truman Angell, right? Truman O. Angell?
Yeah, in fact, I'm just looking it up now. I'm showing a note here that Truman Angell visited and studied the elevator designs in Europe while working on the plans for the Salt Lake Temple.
Yeah, I remember reading that he toured Europe to get ideas for the architectural, how the temple would look, the Salt Lake Temple would look. So,
and you mentioned elevators in the 1850s in the United States. It looks like elevators have been over in like Europe and other places like in the early to mid 1700s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That makes it crazy.
Yeah. So, yeah, whether he left space in the temple or not, I'm not sure that it's relevant. Because the way the story's
told.
Definitely
not revelatory.
Yeah, the way the story's told is that there's no way the builders of the temple would have known about elevators yet. They left some spaces for elevators to be installed after the fact.
So yeah, whether spaces or not, elevators are already around. It's already invented. There's nothing miraculous with the contraptions that take you to the Holy of Holies.
Yeah. Well, there's actually, back to one of our stories we told before, the Lorenzo Snow vision. There are people that believe that Lorenzo Snow was not allowed to see Jesus Christ in the Holy of Holies because of his support of anti-polygamy legislation and his not supporting of polygamy after the fact. So that's why Jesus had to appear to him in the hallway. So funny.
So you're not really worthy of my presence in the special room, but I will visit you out here in the corridor.
Yeah, because you didn't defend polygamy.
Crazy. The Lost Tribes. Like, this is another one when I joined the church, I was told there were lost tribes still hidden in different places of the earth. And I think Elder McConkie or somebody talks about them being under the ice caps. I just want to check with you. Are you aware of us having discovered the 10 lost tribes yet?
Well, no. Today I think we say that the lost tribes just live among us, don't we?
You're saying we changed our theology?
Well, sure. I mean, yeah, loosely. Bruce did say that he thought that they may be under the ice caps, but this is way before we have satellites and we could map the earth and we knew where things were, and it was probably just an idea he had. Cool idea.
And maybe to add one on top of that ties into the Old Testament that we still hold very strongly in our Mormon theology, and we still have lessons every year on this, but the city of Enoch, right? This city was so righteous. Enoch was such a good leader. He got an entire city to be righteous, and I mean like super righteous, that God comes down and like carves out this chunk of earth with this city in it, and that city then takes off and goes up into outer space. Any thoughts on if we've, on our visits to like the moon or sending like satellites out, have we located the city of Enoch yet?
I know that you and I both enjoy reading Jack Spong, and he likes to talk about a three-tiered universe and how a lot of these people describe the world around them believing in a three-tiered universe, which, hell was below terra firma where they, stood. And heaven was in the sky just above the clouds. And so telling a story like the city of Enoch literally rising into the sky would have made sense with their understanding of the universe, since it just rose above the clouds as they told the story. But, that doesn't make very much sense with what we know today.
And yet that's still a big piece of Mormon theology, is the city of Enoch, and we're, trying to create Zion here, and we use Enoch in that city as kind of the example to kind of pattern ourselves up after. But the reality is that chances are none of us, no matter how righteous we are, will ever live in outer space on a piece of this earth.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's figurative, like a lot of the Old Testament. You think it's just a metaphor?
I hope so, because there's a lot less oxygen up there. Yeah,
they wouldn't have done very well once they got about 12,500 feet up. They would have started to pass out, but that's why I think you have to just take these, don't you have to take these stories as just, metaphoric stories that people tell to explain God and what their ideas of God.
Yeah, I very much do that myself. I just hope that we can begin as a faith to make space for that kind of non-literal belief. Let's get back to something really tangible. World War II. There is this interesting story I've heard before with a Japanese kamikaze pilot, right? On his way to Pearl Harbor with the rest of his flight crew, he kind of goes off the path, and rather than going after Pearl Harbor, this gentleman tries to bomb the Hawaii temple, and
three different times,
makes the effort to do it, and because of a miraculous intervention of God, it's unable to occur.
Yeah. This story has always been a hard one for me, because you have the Japanese fleet sails to Pearl Harbor to hopefully sink and destroy the bulk of the United States Navy. But one pilot with one bomb under his plane decides to announce the presence of them 15 minutes before they reach their military target and try to bomb a church. That story to me is a hard one. It doesn't make any sense. I'm sure this guy was executed the minute he landed if he really tried to do something like this, right? I mean,
right.
Can you imagine his commanders? What, you did what, man? You saw some church and we're going to try to drop your bomb on it? And then, him saying, "No, man, it didn't work. My bomb wouldn't drop, Handle was broken. It no go." And you can imagine them saying, what are you talking about? You had a job to do. That bomb was for a battleship, not a church,
Right.
So.
Surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Everything. I mean, like every detail of this attack is planned for. And these Japanese, air combat fighters are like the whole goal is to catch Pearl Harbor by surprise. And to risk it over some religious building, like you say, seems absolutely ridiculous. And if I remember right, the sources for this story, you have one Hawaii guy, like when he's a kid, he's like laying on his back in a field and he sees a plane go by a few times. And he tells the story that he thinks the plane was trying to attack the Hawaii temple. And then isn't there some Japanese guy after the war, when the missionaries go to see him, he has like these regrets and sees an old photo of a Washington DC temple and says he tried to bomb that place and tells the missionaries to get out of his home.
Yeah, I think it's
that he's
the
never
actual,
been at peace since.
I think it's the actual Laia temple, that they show him a picture of, and but once again, this is a very late story. I'm not sure that it's, reliable from a historian's perspective, but an interesting story.
Me pull lever, bomb no drop. Me try 3 times.
Can you imagine the captain of the ship, his commander, saying, "You did what, man? You were supposed to fly to Pearl Harbor. You left your squadron. You're all by yourself." Oh, yeah, I don't think he would have made it back to Japanese soil.
No, right. This would have been, this would have been counter to everything they had planned for. Let's see. What else do we got here? I'm just looking through, Simon's Rider, right? Simon's Rider, again, people leave the church over simple reasons, Chris. Nobody has a legitimate reason for leaving the church. Yeah, and that includes Simon's Rider, who left because his name was spelled wrong.
Simon's Rider's name was never spelled right. It's not even right on his headstone, on his tombstone. I don't know that his name was ever spelled right. And even after his, supposed name being spelled wrong and it offended him, he stayed in the church for another, year and a half?
Yeah. Yep. Almost a year and a half. 1830 census, SIMONDS, 1840 census, SYMONDS, 1850 census, his wife's name is spelled wrong, 1860 census, they're back to using a Y. The 1850 they used an I again. 1870 was SYMANDS. Like if this guy got offended because his name was spelled wrong, he was offended like every day of his life.
Exactly.
Like the guy who got his name right was like a miracle.
Yeah, that's right. That's who he should have followed when they got this name, get his name spelled right.
Right. There's our prophet. He got it right. Yeah. They mean his wife's name is Mahitable. They get her name slaughtered in every census. They've got his name messed up in every census. It's a crazy thing. And you're right. On the tombstone, the word disciples is spelled wrong. DESCIPLES. Mm-hmm. Just crazy. To the day that guy died and even beyond, that guy never got a fair break on the spelling within his life.
You think we got it right when we did his temple work? I'm sure his temple work's been done a few times at this point.
Yeah, I'm sure we probably did it for all the spellings, right?
We may have.
I mean, if Hitler gets like 6 baptisms, Simon's Rider should get at least a couple dozen.
I would think.
Right.
And there's a lot of other Mormon folklore. Cain's a fun one to talk about.
Not too much of that anymore, right? Cain is Bigfoot. Not too much of that anymore. We don't really hit that.
No. There's a good article on it though. A few years ago, there was a really fun article. That's about it. That's about all I can think of. Do you have anything else?
No, I mean, there's other things, but I think they're all just ridiculous.
Well, why do you think, and I don't think this is unique to Mormonism, but why do you think we are, obsessed with telling faith-promoting stories?
My simple answer would be, we believe for us, and again, I get this goes way beyond Mormonism, but for us as Mormonism, like we're the true church. We're the true and living church. We have priesthood. We have keys. We have the power and authority of God. Like if miracles aren't present here, what does that say? And so I think there's always been this concerted effort in Mormonism to almost accept without questioning these super miraculous stories. And I'll give an example using the Holland story. When Elder Holland's story was first told in the Deseret News, the moment I saw it, the moment you saw it, the moment Radio Free Mormon, who did an episode this morning, it is the 3rd of August that we're doing this, when he did his episode that just released this morning, he said he knew it right away. As soon as this came out, like his spidey sense was going off. And yet the traditional Orthodox member of the church believes these things just without even questioning them because, first off, we trust our leaders. We trust our leaders to have vetted these stories, and we're expecting the supernatural within Mormonism. And I think that, again, goes outside of Mormonism. I think religious people in general are much more accepting of not only a miraculous story, but a story so miraculous that it has 8, 9, 10 different phenomenal pieces that just have to line up. And it's just less likely for those folks to kind of question that sort of thing. Whereas someone like me, like, soon as I hear a story and I go, nah, I don't think that happened. And I'll just kind of hold out for more information to come out before I make any kind of judgment call that actually did occur.
So do you believe that God still performs miracles?
So I'm really open to miracles. I've had some experience in my own life, but they're much more mundane. I don't see God parting seas today. I don't see God raining down fires. I don't see prophets striking critics dumb, mute, or having a 3-day slumber. I don't see 2,000 stripling warriors going up against a more experienced, larger, army of soldiers and walking away with only some blood loss and a little bit of fainting. Like, I just think the internet's here. We've got access to media sources and technology that we can verify history in the very moment it happens. And now that we can do that, these real giant supernatural miracles no longer seem to occur. And so, yes, I'm okay with miracles. I'm okay with even a healing, from time to time. I'm just not, if it sounds too good to be true and it involves supernatural power, you hear that thunder?
Yeah, that's a sign.
Maybe that's God telling me right now that we need to probably close this podcast up.
That could have been my stomach.
That's going to be good.
I'm hungry.
Well, maybe it was your stomach.
Do you enjoy living in a world though where miracles, large miracles, big miracles don't seem to be taking place?
It's a good question. I would have said no probably 5-10 years ago, but to the world I live in, like I think God works through natural means, and I'm certainly open to a heavenly Father and a supreme being, but I see him as much more hands-off, much more letting us use our agency and not really interrupting the flow of things through supernatural means. I just don't really see that being the way God operates. And I'm using the last, 300 years, 400 years as an example. I just don't, in the last 400 years of history, see any credible evidence of something just unbelievable happening that there's just no way to explain it.
No, fair enough.
What do you think?
I agree with a lot of what you said. It doesn't appear that these grand miracles of the past, we don't seem to be experiencing those. It saddens me, but I also, my belief would be, I believe that a lot of this is people trying to explain the unexplainable. And the more we learn and the more we learn more about the world around us, there's less supernatural to explain.
Right. And that makes perfect sense when you understand how history has unfolded and how human beings have unfolded and how we've told history and told stories and told legends and fables and myths since the beginning of time. I'm with you. Like, the world is much more explainable now, so there's less reason for these kinds of things. So yeah, I'm with you. I think we've taken apart a lot of stories in Mormonism. One we didn't hit on, probably should just touch on just briefly, is the Elsa Johnson story. Maybe we should leave the listeners with a faithful tale. Elsa Johnson had a lame arm. She's in Hiram, Ohio. She's the wife of John Johnson. Joseph Smith arrives in Kirtland, which is just a short distance from Hiram, Ohio. He ends up living with the Johnson family for a short time, him and Emma. This is the location where a mob comes and drags Joseph and Sidney Rigdon outside and into the cold in the winter, and drags them along the ground. Their heads are bumping the ground, which caused Sidney some issues later on and throughout his life. But Elsa Johnson, having this lame arm, she couldn't even reach up to hang her laundry on a clothesline. And Joseph gives her a blessing. And not only do the Latter-day Saints testify that she was healed, but we have like 2 or 3 non-member accounts of people healing, or I should say it, we have 2 or 3 non-member accounts of people in the area. Namely, one of them is a Quaker who is very opposed to Mormonism. And he testifies that Sister Johnson's arm is now miraculously healed.
Is that,
and so maybe,
is that Amos Hayden?
Go ahead.
Is that who you're thinking of?
That sounds right. Yes, Amos Hayden, I believe. Eyewitness, non-believer, in Joseph Smith. And, others too, like Ezra Booth, who is a member, but was a Methodist preacher at the time. I think it's one of the reasons he converts over to the church.
I think you're right. I think that's the event that he converts over.
So while we've kind of knocked down a bunch of a bunch of false, faith-promoting stories of Mormonism, and I'm glad we did this. Like, I think it's important that we recognize that truth is important, and if a story is being told as literally true, and it's not, like, we all need to kind of think about that and be willing to kind of know what the information is and wrestle with it. But, if we leave people with this actual miracle that happens, and, Elsa Johnson, at least for the short term, is able to move her arms as if she was, 15, 20 years younger, she kind of reports back saying, again, I think there are miracles in this world, things we can't explain. And, until I've got a better answer, I'm happy to give Supreme Being or God the credit for that.
Yeah, I am too.
Cool. Anything else on your mind before we close this one up?
No, it's been good. It's been fun.
Excellent. So Chris Bloxam, Bill Reel with Mormon Discussion podcast, tackling, I don't know what we did, maybe a dozen or so, faith promoting stories within Mormonism, and tackling most of them not necessarily happening the way we were told they happened. But a couple of them seem to still be pretty miraculous and, on some level, I think still faith promoting. But yeah, I think going forward, we just, as a church, in a information age, we just all have to do better to do what Elder Ballard said, when he taught the CES teachers not too long ago.
Let me warn you not to pass along faith-promoting or unsubstantiated rumors or outdated understandings and explanations of our doctrine, practices from the past.